Okay, I think we're going to start. Good morning, good evening, or even good afternoon. I am sorry I have to say all three since we're conducting this conference across time zones. Participants, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second annual conference on Indonesian Studies by the American Institute for Indonesian Studies in collaboration with Michigan State University Asian Studies Center. My name is Indira. Today I will be the master of ceremony for this special talk regarding Blackness in Indonesia. First of all, I would like to thank each and every one of you for the participations here today. And also, let's not forget your participations ever since this conference has started. Sadly, we have almost come to the end of this conference. However, I hope we still begin in good health, safe condition, and of course, in an excellent spirit. Ladies and gentlemen, through this conference theme, the emerging discourse and collaboration in a new age, we have covered a lot of topics. And of course, this one is very interesting, and I hope you are all waiting for this special talk with Professor Timothy Daniels. Here's Professor Daniels. Hello, Professor Daniels. I hope you're healthy.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for being here. Professor Daniels is a professor of anthropology at Hofstra University, where he obtained his PhD in cultural anthropology at the University of Illinois. He is now teaching anthropology, religious studies, linguistic anthropology, and urban studies. Of course, he has led numerous joint study faculty research projects in Malaysia. His professional experience leads him to speak for today's session about Blackness in Indonesia. This session will be moderated by Dr. Robert Bob Hafner. Hello, Dr. Hafner. How are you today? Welcome to the session.
Baik-baik saja. Terima kasih.
Dr. Hafner here will be introducing this topic and, of course, the full introduction for Professor Daniels. Dr. Hafner is a professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Pardee School of Global Affairs at Boston University. And he is also the APHIS president. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start the session, I would like to note that there will be Q&A session for 30 minutes after Professor Daniels presented his ideas. So don't be afraid, you can still shoot your questions. You can send your questions through the Q&A feature in the WUVA website. It is on the right side of your window. The Q&A session will then be conducted and be moderated by Dr. Hafner. I hope this session will spark a fruitful discussion where we can learn more about racial problems in Indonesia. Now, without further ado, Dr. Hafner, please, you may have the floor. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Indira. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Every once in a while in one's life, and I guess I'm getting on as an Indonesianist, been in this field, and Southeast Asianist, been in this field for quite some time. But every so often, someone comes along who's doing research, a variety of scholarship, who catches your attention. Well, that's nothing new. Catches your attentions, kind of putting it in an understated way. Every so often, someone comes along who sort of addresses issues in which one personally, I'm, speaking as we all are, Indonesianists. Someone comes along who's addressing issues that are very similar to what you might, and in this case, with regard to Professor Timothy Daniels, I might think that I'm addressing, but that person comes along and does it in a way that sort of is ahead of you, even though you think of yourself as kind of fully abreast of where everything's going in a particular field. Timothy P. Daniels, as you heard, professor of anthropology at Hofstra University, has been, from the beginning of his career, one of those people for me. I didn't know him when I began to read his work. all I can say is that I think it was somewhere around the 2000s or so, he began to publish, and I would read something that he did, whether it was on Malaysia or whether it was on Indonesia. And from the start, he was doing both. I would be, oh, gosh, I should read this. And then when I did read it, I would say, oh, gosh, he did this so much better than what I could do. And that, I mean, it'd be not embarrassing if that was the case after, kind of with an initial splash of a book. And one of those splashes of books that he published was 2009. I don't think this was his first article or work. I really haven't done my homework systematically. But he published a book called Islamic Spectrum in Java, where he had done research in Yogyakarta and South Central Java generally. At a time when since 1999, I was doing research in Jogja, sort of taking my time with it. I had started out, as I think a few people probably know, although this is long before anybody's time, I had started out in East Java looking at Hindu-Muslim relations in the Tunggar Highlands, and then sort of gone into the lowlands. And then starting around 99, I moved to Jogja and began doing annual research there. So around 2009, if I'm not mistaken, a book comes out. I haven't published what I thought was going to be, a book, my book on Jogja. And it was just so good. It was so rich. It covered the angles both of the cultural diversity in Java and then also the varieties of ways of being Muslim in Yogyakarta and Java, that I was literally, I'm going to sound a little bit dated here, I was blown away. It was a brilliant book. And there's so much in the market of Indonesian and Malaysian studies now, no one can keep up. But if you've not had an opportunity to read this is one of the great books of Java studies. Okay, so there was the one, and I was sort of wiping my brow and saying, oh, okay, that's okay. Okay, he got there, he did the book, okay, I can move on and stuff. So what I thought I would move on to was sort of Malaysia, where I had done a year's research in 1999. And lo and behold, in 2013, before I had written anything, with the exception of the small multiculturalism book in 99 or 2000, whenever it was, he wrote another absolutely path-breaking, synthetic, and deeply intersectional. He's an anthropologist, but he's an intersectional study of building cultural nationalism in Malaysia, identity, representation, and citizenship. And absolutely, again, another remarkable book, but all the more remarkable because here he was, a scholar who had done work in Java, in Indonesian. He very quickly moves on to Malaysia. So again, I had done my year in 1999 in Malaysia. And I was thinking, okay, wow. He continues to sort of touch on those issues that I'm interested in and that I've done research on, and he does it ahead of me and better, with this linguistic style, a narrative style, a richness of ethnographic and broad scope research that is again and again impressive. So I thought, well, okay, at least now I can rest. I shifted my attention. I was doing work, getting a little bit more conceptual, doing what some scholars of Islam call the epistemological turn, where you're not just doing ethnography, local studies, but you're looking at the way in which Muslims, at least those Muslims who regard fiqh, and that is jurisprudence and Sharia, as somehow a core part of what one has to take seriously to be a proper Muslim. And not all Muslims do. As Timothy had already said in Islamic Spectrum in Java. But in any case, I had shifted to Sharia, and I had a couple of projects and a couple of edited volumes with collaborators, both in Indonesia and around the world. But lo and behold, Timothy Daniels I think I'm trying to remember, I think 2016, I had sort of gotten a couple things out, but he came out with what was an edited volume, but a collaborative project that was, again, path-breaking. And I will say this, I know I'm being too effusive, but brilliant. Sharia dynamics, Islamic law, and sociocultural processes looked at the dynamics, again, took this epistemological turn that was taking place in Islamic studies generally, and also the anthropology of Islam in Southeast Asia, and just put it in a global context masterfully. Now, as if that were not enough, and I'm going to end here, I know I'm overextending my introduction. In 2017, another book comes out. I don't know if, is this going to come up? I don't know if that's clear, but the book is entitled Living Sharia Law and Practice in Malaysia, 2017. And it's, again, it applies the same kind of pluralist anthropological, but also Islamic studies, cultural studies, comparative perspective that we saw in his research in Indonesia. But it uses it to address what I think, and I think many people in Islamic studies would agree, is one of the most important issues in the comparative study of Islam today, which is how Muslims understand ethics and how they link ethics to the degree they do to some and typically varied understandings of Sharia. I will say this at the risk of, again, of being accused of a certain measure of hyperbole. I will say again that Living Sharia Law and Practice in Malaysia, I read comparatively. This is one of the best books I have ever read on the lived experience of Sharia and its plurality anywhere. Now, I'll close just by saying I haven't done justice to what Professor Daniels has done. He's done research, including in 2013 on performance, popular culture, and piety in Muslim Southeast Asia. Come on already, Professor Daniels. Enough already. In this edited volume, which brought together just an absolutely exciting body of scholars looking again at popular culture and piety, in addition to doing just a masterful introduction, he did 2 chapters, not one, wasn't enough, again, kind of overachiever to the max. One on Islamic dramas, you know, sinetron and Islamic drama Islami. And the other one, as if, again, the versatility were not already demonstrated, on dangdut, and popular culture generally, the popular sort of semi-rock, but Islamically inflected musical tradition that we see in Indonesia. He's currently, I don't know, he's doing research, he's also done research on shadow puppetry in Qadiria. He's also published on, and you note that I'm holding this to the end, because I think it's more proper for me to end here and turn it over to him. He's done a variety of, again, path breaking. There's nobody like him. Works on Africans in Malaysia, on the perception of African Americans in both of those countries, and then, of course, on questions of subjectivity and his own identity in both of those national settings. In short, I apologize for being a little long-winded in my introduction, but Timothy Daniels, in my view, is really one of the, not just an outstanding African-American scholar, he is one of the breathtaking leaders in Southeast Asian studies as an anthropologist, as a scholar of Islam, and as a scholar of popular culture. Professor Daniels, thank you for agreeing to talk and joining us here this evening. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Bob, for a very, very kind introduction. I do have to say that I've been inspired over the years by your 20 to 30 books. And one day I'll have to give you an introduction, you know, discussing some of those. I think you've been an inspiration to most of us in Southeast Asian studies. I'd also like to thank APHIS and MSU for inviting me to give this talk today. And my talk is based on a recently published article, which is entitled Blackness in Indonesia, Articulations of Colonial and Post-Colonial Racial Epistemologies. And so just to get right into it for the sake of time, indigenous Papuans and dark-skinned visitors from Africa and North America experience anti-Black racism in Indonesia, a former European colony with a white supremacist legacy. Attempting to explain this contemporary racism, scholars are often caught between stressing either the colonial background or post-colonial racialization and tend to describe the latter as merely a redeployment of the colonial legacy. For instance, Jan Pauwer writes that when we, quote, take into account Indonesian representations and ideology relating to the region and people, we find a variant of the same Dutch colonial theme, end of quote, a slew of denigrating images and ideas about Papuans. Similarly, Martin Slama and Jenny Monroe focus on the relevance of the quote unquote Stone Age image of Papuans with Dutch colonial roots to contemporary social and political dynamics. Sophia Chow, describing the historical emergence of the Papuan quote unquote race, notes that, quote, after West Papua was forcibly incorporated into the Republic of Indonesia in 1961, colonial and pre-colonial representations of Papuans as primordial, bestial, and infantile became institutionalized in the practices of successive governance structures, end of quote. The complex connections of colonial white supremacy to post-colonial racial formations have been under-theorized. To what extent are frameworks and logics for construing Blackness continuations and or transformations of white supremacy? How are these constructions of Blackness integral to a system of political, economic, and social domination? Do they indicate a global system of white supremacy? In this study of Blackness in the world's most populous Muslim majority country, I attempt to answer these questions and contribute to an anthropology of race, racism, and white supremacy. Critical race theory provides a powerful framework for understanding racial epistemologies and worldviews, processes of race making, and the ways social constructions of race articulate with and are situated within systems of power and material relations. Building on this scholarship, I analyze racial epistemologies that Dutch colonial power constructed, as well as those Indonesian nationalist elites produced in post-colonial contexts. It is crucial to not only consider how colonial racial schemas differed from post-colonial schemas, but also the radical shift colonial power wrought on pre-colonial social modalities through its use of racial science. I describe how Europeans imposed racial meanings on phenotypic differences among peoples in the region. Colonial representations of dark-skinned Papuans as backwards, less evolved, Stone Age people have had a lasting impact on racial ideologies in the region. To understand post-colonial Indonesian anti-Black racism, my work adopts a dual focus on the colonial legacy of negative ideas and images about dark-skinned people, as well as other forms of racism linked to the post-colonial nation state. Many scholars have recognized the widespread phenomena of articulations of race and other forms of social inequality, such as gender and class, to visions of the nation, national identity, and nationalism. In this article, I demonstrate that post-colonial Indonesian elites constructed a form of nationalism centered around light-skinned indigenous Indonesians, while marginalizing dark-skinned groups as lower-graded citizens of the nation. I argue that anti-Black ideas, actions, and policies are complex combinations of white supremacist models and post-colonial light-skinned indigenous Indonesian supremacist models. Moreover, in contemporary racial projects, religious difference is racialized, rendering Papuans and other dark-skinned groups as Black kafir or infidels. These post-colonial racist schemas formed out of the already available cultural resources of white supremacy and indigenous Muslim nationalism persistently reproduce a global system of white supremacy. Indigenous Papuan Indonesians experience what I call compound racial subordination, stemming from their denigration and exclusion within the dual racial supremacy models that post-colonial racial formations perpetuate. I not only examined the shift from colonial to post-colonial racial formations, but also the fluctuating racial projects of various Indonesian regimes and non-governmental organizations. This provides insight into forms of subordination of Black people within these formations, as well as the openings and challenges for the Papuan movement for social justice. Here I draw upon my various periods of research in Indonesia, which Bob touched on, and report stories of local orang hitam, as well as my personal experiences. These stories are gleaned from my field notes and diaries spanning many years. And so to begin with some of the story segment of the paper, which I've cut down just to emphasize a couple of the stories and experiences. During late December 2003, I met two young Papuan women in a shopping mall in Yogyakarta. In contrast to most Javanese I had encountered, these Papuan women straight away recognized and accepted that I was African American. They were advanced fourth-year students in a Christian university in Yogyakarta, both studying communications. I gave them my business card and told them a little bit about my anthropological research on Muslim cultural forms in Yogyakarta. They told me that there is racism against dark-skinned people in Indonesia and asked if there is racial discrimination in the US. Amalia, a young Auyu woman from Mapi, expressed her perception that Blacks in the US must struggle and compete with whites for jobs. I confirmed that there are still major racial problems, but noted that nowadays there are laws against racial discrimination in employment. Amalia and her Marin friend Faustina spoke proudly about the Papuan political movement, striving to address the problem they have with the Indonesian government and foreign businesses profiting from the wealth of Papua. Indigenous Papuans are fed up with it, they said, and are demanding more assets for Papua. They gave me their contact information and walked me out to the front landing where I had parked my motorcycle. 2 weeks later, in early 2004, I ran into Amalia, who was with another of her Papuan girlfriends, Fidelia. I was heading to a restaurant in the mall to eat lunch when they noticed me near the entrance and came over to talk. Two mall security guards were watching us with delight, expressing their amusement in mutual banter and laughter as they stared in our direction. Despite being disturbed by the behavior of these guards, my Papuan friends continued talking. We made an appointment for me to visit their dormitory and engage in more extensive conversation later that week. 4 days later, I followed their directions, weaving around Yogyakarta streets on my motorcycle and arrived at their student boarding house early in the afternoon. They informed me that they often experience impolite racist behavior in Yogyakarta. Local Javanese often stare at them and excitedly tap people in their groups, directing them to turn their attention to Papuan people as if they are some sort of animal or odd spectacle. I told them I experienced the same behavior from Javanese when I am out in public places. They told me a story about a friend of theirs who confronted some light-skinned pre-booming men about their rude behavior of gawking at him while standing in line at an ATM. Amalia and Faustina complained that this happens to them all the time, and they feel very insulted by Javanese engaging in these impolite acts toward them. They felt that these actions were expressions of pikiran racists, a form of thinking that looks down on dark-skinned people and considers whites and light-skinned people as superior. Amalia added that these racist acts stem from watak, post-colonial. They noted that Chinese Indonesians do not react to Black people the way Javanese do. I agree with them based on my personal experience of interacting with local Chinese Indonesians. Expressing frustration with their marginalization, Amalia proclaimed, "We are pre-Bumi too, Papuan pre-Bumi." During the remaining 6 months of my research in South Central Java in 2004, I occasionally visited my Papuan friends or met them at popular locations in public. Even after this period of research was complete, I remained in contact with Amalia, Faustina, and some other Papuan friends. They informed me that they found the broader environment in Yogyakarta to be unwelcoming. Javanese managers of student boarding houses scrutinized and interrogated them if they had male visitors, if they were visiting male dormitories. They felt that their cultural differences were not tolerated by the operators of small Javanese warung. Moreover, Papuan students also reported that teachers often discriminate against them by consistently passing them over in favor of light-skinned pre-Bumi students when it comes to being selected for certain scientific fields, doctoral studies, pilot projects, and so forth. In her ethnographic study of Dani University students in North Sulawesi, Jenny Monroe demonstrates that lower-class indigenous West Papuan youth work very hard to support themselves financially and to speak fluent Indonesian, only to face racial stigmatization in university social context. My Papuan friends also felt that the police were keeping them under surveillance because they organized demonstrations demanding justice and human rights for Papuans. Papuans often experience and endure hostile racist statements that denigrate and place them on the lower rungs of racial hierarchies. My Papuan friends told me that racist ideas in Indonesian society cast them as being like monkeys and as stupid, dirty, and backward savages. Amalia stated that when she and her friends were studying in Yogyakarta, they heard Javanese students calling Papuan soccer players munyu and ketek in Javanese language as they watched soccer matches. Sometimes they would even hop around on the floor mimicking a monkey. These Papuan soccer players were on the Persipura team, a team fans widely recognized as one of the most talented in Indonesia. Papuans called this team Mutiara Hitam, conveying their Black racial pride. Hurling the slur of monkeys at players on this team, a valued Papuan symbol of Blackness, was a painful expression of racism. European soccer fans have flung similar anti-Black racist insults at African players. In Indonesia, Europe, and beyond, these demeaning statements and related actions like tossing bananas to Black players are evidence of the persistence and global character of white supremacist tropes and mental models. In Indonesia, these tropes and cognitive schemas are intertwined with the nationalist project of maintaining state control over West Papua, reaping material benefits from its resources and suppressing the popular Papuan movement for independence. Anthropologist Sophia Chow, who conducted ethnographic research in the Papuan district of Merauke between 2013 and 2019, found Indonesian, quote, military forces frequently intimidated Papuan children with their batons and guns, calling them monkeys and taunted them for their dark skin and curly hair, end of quote. My Papuan contacts informed me that on occasion, often in response to Papuan demands for freedom, light-skinned Indonesians claim that Papuans are newcomers to Indonesia and that they should return to where they are from in Africa. Amid a controversy over Papuan students removing an Indonesian flag on August 17, 2019, Indonesian Independence Day, nationalists and Muslim vigilantes barricaded Papuan students and unleashed verbal and physical assaults on them, including the yelling of monyet outside of their dormitory in Surabaya, East Java. Rather than dispersing the racist mob, police and military forces stormed into the student dormitory and arrested Papuan students in front of the crowd. This event, video recorded and disseminated on social media, sparked mass protests of West Papuans across Indonesia and led to extremely violent attempts by the military, police, and civil militia to quash the Papuan liberation movement, killing its leaders, attacking, arresting, and imprisoning its supporters. Although President Joko Widodo has expressed rhetoric in favor of dialogue and Papuan human rights, he has enacted racist policies of violent repression of the Papuan struggle that is increasingly united around demands for a referendum on independence. The movement for Black Lives and its popular rallying call and name of one of its component organizations, Black Lives Matter, became a potent cry for indigenous West Papuans, quote, in the context of their ongoing experiences of marginalization and oppression, Sophia Chow wrote. My Papuan friends from 2003 to the present have expressed strong support for the Papuan movement for human rights and freedom from domination by the Indonesian state. Following the fall of the Suharto regime in 1998, Papuan activists and their allies mobilized and experienced a greater opening for dialogue around their concerns under Presidents Habibie and Abdurrahman Wahid. The SARA policy, which restricted people and groups from openly discussing potentially divisive issues surrounding race, ethnicity, religion, and intergroup relations, was part of Suharto's racial project. Suharto's skillful deployment of racial and religious difference as a political tool, scapegoating Christians and Chinese for unpopular policies, fomented Muslim animosity toward these groups. With the lifting of Suharto's repressive clamp on public discourse, Papuan activists appealed to Indonesian leaders and various segments of civil society for change in the racial order. The special autonomy law was passed that purportedly extended more political and economic power to Papuans. Around 3 years after the implementation of the special autonomy policy for Papua, Amalia told me that she was supportive of the Papuan movement and hoped that it would attain more autonomy for Papuans. She said it had, quote, had been effective in fighting for their rights and brought many fruits for them, including a larger percentage of the profits from government and foreign use of their resources, end of quote. She added that it is still not clear what autonomy means, but that if their movement continues to demand more autonomy the way they have, she was confident that they would give more concessions, that they would get more concessions from the central government. President Megawati Soekarno-Putri and her successor Yudhoyono avoided genuine consultation and moved to consolidate their control over West Papua and intensify repression of the growing movement for independence. Megawati Soekarno-Putri delayed the establishment of the Papua People's Assembly, MRP, until 2005 and unilaterally created the province of West Irian Jaya in 2003. Massive protests of Papuans rejected special autonomy policies, arguing that it be withdrawn and real solutions be implemented. In June 2010, the MRP sent a list of recommendations, including a request that the special autonomy law be returned to Jakarta. During my 2010 visit to Indonesia, I had several conversations with Anselina, a Marin friend of Amalia, about the Papuan movement for justice and separation from the Indonesian state. She vented frustration with how the so-called special autonomy policy had not changed the persistent conceptual and structural racism toward Papuans. She spoke about the police and military surveillance and violence targeting Papuans, as well as the hatred Muslim Indonesians uttered and acted out toward Papuans, castigating them as non-Muslims. At times, activist Muslim organizations racialized predominantly non-Muslim groups. Here they are not only kafir or non-believers, but rather black kafir, undermining Indonesian national integrity and development or destabilizing the nation state with calls for human rights and political independence. Thus, racialized religion upholds white supremacy in the post-colonial racial formation that exalts the citizenship of light-skinned indigenous Muslims. One of the outcomes of the post-Suharto opening of spaces is that several hardline political Islamic organizations began to agitate and take aggressive actions against groups they deemed to be threats to their political religious visions for the Indonesian nation state. The racial projects of several of these religious nationalist organizations are violently opposed to the betterment of predominantly Christian groups whose identities often involve intersections of religious and racial difference. Their cultural models and associated sentiments entail hostility toward Christians and Blacks. On the other hand, there are also segments of civil society promoting more inclusive racial projects, such as a group of Indonesian scholars at the Indonesian Institute of Sciences who collaborated with Father Nelis Tebe, a prominent Catholic intellectual, to produce the roadmap proposing several areas of conflict that needed to be addressed in a Jakarta, Papua dialogue. In online discussions with Amalia in 2020, she informed me that under the special autonomy policy, only the local political leaders of the government are Papuans. Quote, but the police and military are majority Amber Indonesians, and those working to build Papua are mostly Amber Indonesians. Most of the policies are definitely for the benefit of Amber people. As long as there has been special autonomy in Papua, it has not improved the conditions of Papuans. For that reason, it is better for Papuans to live on their own. We don't want Amber control anymore. I mean, we just want Papua Merdeka, end of quote. While some of my contacts are in favor of improving human rights under the current political arrangement, my Papuan interlocutors are overwhelmingly in favor of political independence. They support demonstrations and demands for a referendum on Papuan political independence. Papuans produce a positive identity of themselves as Black people and use the term Amber to refer to any group of outsiders coming to Papua. However, the prototype of Amber people that I inferred from my discussions with Papuans is a racial representation of people with yellow skin and straight hair. Nevertheless, darker-skinned indigenous Indonesians from other eastern provinces of the archipelago, such as Maluku and East Nusa Tenggara, are also considered Amber by Papuans. While light-skinned Indonesians categorize and clump these groups together with Papuans as Orang Hitam or Negroes, Papuans distinguish themselves from these other dark-skinned groups in Indonesia. Amalia clarified their perspective on this matter, informing me that many of these other groups, schooled in racism by light-skinned Indonesians, considered themselves as better than Papuans. She felt that they imagined themselves as being higher on the racial hierarchy. On the other hand, Amalia stated that Papuans identify strongly with Black people in the region. Indigenous Black Australians and Black people in Melanesia and Africans and Blacks in the Americas. In fact, I often listen to reggae music and R&B with Amalia and her friends in their dormitory in 2004. The creativity and resistance of these musical genres articulated feelings of achievement and confident struggle that resonated with my Papuan friends. Similarly, Sarah Richards found that, quote, for younger enthusiasts, hip hop presents as a global Black aesthetic, which in the context of racial histories and landscapes is being appropriated to configure an esteemed vision of Papuans as attractive, stylish, talented, and potentially wealthy, end of quote. My Papuan friends and I had close affinity as Black people, a bond facilitated by our common embrace of a sense of Blackness rooted in experiences of anti-Black racist oppression and Black resistance and celebrations of Black excellence and beauty. Negative representations of Black men were articulated to me in a crude and mocking way by several adult men during my work in upland ethnic Daya villages in 1997. I returned from an earlier trip in 1995 to South Sumatra with a plan of conducting research for my doctoral dissertation on processes of rural to urban migration and cultural change. Pak Lakoni, a civil servant I met in Palembang, invited me to visit the village his family comes from, located in a remote highland part of Ogan Kombreng Ulu, an inland district, and observe his relative's upcoming wedding and learn about Daya culture in his rural context. I set out on this enthralling but perhaps ill-advised trip with Pak Lakoni, a contact that I did not know very well. After several days of meeting local storytellers, musicians, experts on local customs, and observing the wedding process of Lakoni's cousin's daughter, we visited his cousin's house as they prepared for the wedding ceremony and party. I sat downstairs with a group of young married men who spoke to me rather explicitly about their sexual desires. One of them, Andrian, told me that he was already married, but wanted to follow me back to the US so that he could engage in sex outside of wedlock with, quote, a big white American woman, end of quote. They joked with me about my size, declaring that Indonesian women were too small for me. Andrian said, quote, you would hurt Indonesian women because you have a very large penis, end of quote. Later that night, following the wedding ceremony, the village headman from the bride's village asked me to sit out front near the road with him and several other village headmen from the area. They told me the youth event was about to start and asked me if I wanted to marry a local girl, affirming that it would not be difficult. I said, sure, I'm interested. If it is possible, the local women are beautiful. But the joke was on me. A few of the men followed with the punchline. You were too big, and physically it would be too painful for our girls since you have such a big penis, end of quote. I laughed with them, knowing that I was in no position to protest, but added that there would not be a problem. The headmen and the men hanging around with them got a kick out of this racist mockery. My Papuan interlocutors have informed me that white and Black men are occasionally depicted as too large and overly sexual to discourage local women from marrying foreigners. However, in this context, I interpret that Black masculinity for these Indonesians encompassed notions of excessive sexual potency and unnaturally large genitalia, ideas circulated around the world reproducing global white supremacy. Scholars have demonstrated that racist stereotypes of Black men as sexually out of control, hypersexual and brutes oriented towards criminality proliferate in electronic media. Many of these series and movies circulate white supremacist values around the world. In addition, for some Daya and Malays in these upland areas and in Palembang, Blackness was not welcome in my narrative of conversion to Islam. Following breakfast the day before I departed from their village, Rumsi, Lakoni's brother, began to question me about my family background. How many people are Muslims in your family? When did you convert? Did you go through a period of Islamic instruction first? Their mother, Ibu, and her younger sister came in at this point and sat down in the front reception area of the house, which rarely happens in local culture. Local men instructing me in their patriarchal scheme of domestic matters describe this space as a male space and the area at the back of the house as female space. Ibu told me yesterday in the bride's village that she wanted to speak to me, and this appeared to be what she wanted to speak about. She was dressed in a shining white robe and headscarf, a portrait of piety that contrasted with the practice of her sons, who never performed their daily prayers from my experience. Ibu started drilling into me where her son had left off. Why did you enter Islam when you did at the age of 10? I was following my older brothers, cousins, and large numbers of Black people in the US during that time. There was a Black Islamic movement. It was not the answer she was looking for or required. Ibu went on forcefully, Islam is the best religion in the world. Yes, it is, I quickly agreed. But the immediate reasons why, and many others around me at that time converted, was because of the political context in the US. In a sense, it was similar to the Islamic movement in Indonesia during Dutch rule. She was not satisfied and began to preach to me about the differences between Islam and Christianity. She recited Quran and she made her points about how there is only one God and not three, and that Allah does not have a son, and that Christians do not recognize Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The men sat around and quietly listened, as did I. However, Lakoni stood up and quickly walked out the front door as his mother got started. He had heard enough for some reason, perhaps, leaving to control his anger toward me for getting his mother upset. Anyway, I sat and listened and agreed with what Ibu was saying, but still insisted that the motives for many Black people to convert to Islam in the US in the 1960s and early 70s were linked to the politics of racial inequality and injustice. Previously in Palembang, Lakoni's wife had the same frustration and inability to appreciate the possibility of a different context shaping motives for turning to Islam. The universal answer, so to speak, a clear embrace of Islamic monotheism, Tawhid, would have been the satisfactory answer and would have saved me from the ridiculing tone of Ibu. After she finished preaching down to me, they packed into the van outside without so much as bidding me peace. Later that day, Lakoni slipped a traditional poison/potion into my dinner. I barely made it back to Palembang alive. Although he clearly had some financial motives, offering to provide me with an antidote in return for my computer and a sum of money, I wonder how much these exchanges with his wife and mother and my seemingly less than ideal conversion to Islam justified his violence against my Black body. Struggling to remain in the field, I endured the deleterious effects of the poison on my body for several weeks before deciding to return to the US. Throughout my several periods of research in Indonesia, locals exhibited difficulty with conceiving of me as an American and with combining Blackness with Americanness. In response to my answers to questions about where I am from, Indonesians would often react with confusion and add America Latin or America Selatan to America. On several occasions, when my interlocutors realized I was a Black person from the United States of America, they labeled me a Negro. Later, when my wife, Fariha, a native of Yogyakarta, and I were reporting to government offices in 2003, civil servants with my passport and other documents before them often uttered American but Black, Orang Amerika tapi hitam, with a mixture of astonishment and disgust. For instance, in September 2003, after finding the LINMAS office, the Military Civil Defense Forces office, we stepped in and we were greeted by a middle-aged civil servant in uniform. She looked at my documents and asked, "You're S2 or S3?" When the documents clearly stated doctor, so on and so forth. She looked at my passport copies in amazement, saying American but Black to Fariha in Indonesian language, and then asked hurriedly if I understood. I had been speaking Indonesian with her from the start, so I obviously understood and proceeded to tell her what she had said. I informed her that there are many Blacks in the US, and in fact, all sorts of people. After we left this office, Fariha said, quote, "They acted surprised like this because they are racist," end of quote. From their perspective, Americans are by default white, and whiteness is representative of the US. Black diasporic subjects are rendered as inauthentic residents in a white place. Global white supremacy entails racialization of geopolitical spaces, spaces where Black people belong and spaces where they do not. A little bit into understanding this. So I'll touch on a little bit of the analysis for just a short time. These forms of anti-Black racism are rooted in the race-making of European powers from the 15th through 19th centuries as they enslaved and colonized various peoples around the world. As they intensified their accumulation of wealth and exploitation of labor, Dutch colonizers constructed a racial hierarchy with categories, ideas, and evaluations of presumably distinct types of people. It is crucial to note that this colonial schema of racial differences, like those of other European colonialists of this period, was a radical break from pre-existing schemas locals used to differentiate and evaluate groups. For instance, Portuguese and Spanish observers in the 16th and 17th centuries stated that Muslims in the region called Papuans kafir, or non-believers, and preached Islam to them. Warnk and Slama note that North Malucan sultanates formed trade relations with Papuans, awarded Papuan chiefs with titles, and considered Papua a non-Muslim frontier ripe for proselytization of Islam. That is, local Muslim leaders and preachers, Malays and Hadramis, stressed the religious rather than physical attributes of Papuans. Similarly, many historians note the importance of geographical locations, highland, lowland, upstream, downstream, and trade between these zones for pre-colonial intergroup relations in Southeast Asia. In contrast, Dutch rulers created a racialized framework that defined Papuans as dark-skinned people with curly hair and cast them on the bottom of the racial hierarchy as Stone Age savages. They believed that whites, man-selected, quote-unquote, by evolution, as Winter put it, were the most advanced and superior in all moral and physical attributes. Their mixed-race progeny, quote, who they had the option of recognizing as European, occupied the next rung, from Rutherford's work. Chinese were considered hardworking and industrious, but inferior to whites in physical attributes and most moral qualities. Indigenous Asians, or Malays, were stereotyped as lazy and stupid natives held to be less civilized than whites and Chinese, but better than Papuans in both moral and physical traits. In the 19th century, Europeans widely adopted the term Black to refer to Papuans, as they were believed to be darker skinned than other oceanic people. Some prominent European authors made a distinction between the Black Papuans and the brown Moluccans. The latter were described as brown-skinned and long-haired and imagined to be more civilized than Papuans. Europeans called Papua Melanesia, Negro land, or Papuanesia, and Papuans oceanic Negroes. The radical break of this racial schema of human diversity from pre-existing frameworks is also indicated by the scientific aura of these racial categories and traits. Whites and Papuans and other categories were believed to be distinct kinds, natural biological divisions of humanity. Grounded in Enlightenment patterns of thought, European naturalists argued that their racial schemas were based on reason and empirical observation. George Windsor Earle, a 19th century British author of several articles on racial types and the authoritative book Papuans, declared that a single glance, quote unquote, is sufficient to distinguish the Malayu Polynesians from the Papuans. Furthermore, the superior Malayu Polynesians left a, quote, line of improvement in the eastern regions that they influenced. Alfred Russel Wallace, another influential British author and scientist, agreed, like several others, that he had discovered the ethnological line in the region separating the Malays and all Asiatic races from the Papuans and all oceanic Negroes. This line was presented as a true and natural division between Malay and Papuan races based on reason and his direct observations in the region. European powers used these pseudo-scientific and accurate representations of human diversity to fortify colonial regimes. exploit racialized labor, and accumulate capital. Colonial rulers transferred models of white supremacy and inferior others to post-colonial governments and disseminated them around the world. After secular and Muslim nationalist leaders declared independence, issued the Compromise Constitution in 1945, and established the Republic of Indonesia in 1949, the model of white supremacy was kept alive. Although Dutch colonial figures were no longer positioned directly atop the political structures, this cultural model of white supremacy was preserved through political and economic relations of subordination and dependency with white-dominated countries and global institutions. Many US, UK, and Australian-based oil, natural gas, and mining multinational corporations established plants and installations and sent Western professionals and managers to run their enterprises in Indonesia. In addition, state-owned palm oil plantations accumulated wealth while significantly contributing to deforestation of West Papua. Resembling Dutch colonial performances with motors, rifles, and gramophones before Papuan villagers, as described by Rutherford, European and Euro-American post-colonial performances on a world stage with modern technology, including military weaponry, reproduce models of white supremacy. Moreover, this racist model was embedded in the preservation of Dutch legal and education systems. It was also spread through Western media, films, and television shows. Indonesian youth were taught that Black people, Papuans and Indonesian Negroes, Africans and African descendants in the Americas and Europe were inferior to whites and lighter complexion groups. World history courses in public schools inculcated students with ideas of the African continent as the home of early hominids, and later as the source of slaves to serve white masters. Prominent Indonesian scholars have also inscribed and reproduced negative depictions of Papuans in their academic writing. And Sophia Chow details some of that in her work. Overall, hegemonic state and popular discourse represent Papuans as wild, dangerous, Stone Age pagans in need of improvement and order. However, this white supremacy model was not the only framework utilized to denigrate dark-skinned Indonesians in the emergent post-colonial racial formation. In the context of post-colonial nation building, Indonesian elites formulated a vision of the nation centered around light-skinned indigenous citizens. The depictions and celebrations of a glorious Indonesian pre-colonial history emphasized Javanese, Sundanese, and Malay Muslim and Hindu Buddhist kingdoms. The customary attire, cuisine, house styles, and other cultural traits of light-skinned pre-Bumi ethnic groups were presented as indexing the diversity of Indonesian citizens, which was expressed with the nationalist motto, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. Political elites from these groups, especially Javanese, dominated the Jakarta-based central government that exerted its power over all provinces, including those in Papua. Undeniably, a light-skinned indigenous supremacy model emerged and was institutionalized in post-colonial Indonesia. While recognizing light-skinned indigenous ethnic groups as full citizens, it marginalizes Chinese Indonesians and dark-skinned indigenous ethnic groups and qualifies their belonging to the nation. Chinese were evaluated lowly in this framework due to their presumed foreign origins, no matter how many generations their families have lived in Indonesia. During periods of crisis and conflict, Chinese Indonesians were often blamed and targeted as scapegoats. The New Order regime placed a 32-year ban on Chinese cultural expressions and subjected them to a forced assimilation policy. Dark-skinned ethnic groups from East Nusa Tenggara to Papua are evaluated lowly due to a slew of negative ideas associated with orang hitam, or Negroes. Within some post-colonial racial projects, non-Muslim Papuans and other non-Muslim Black people are despised and targeted as Black kafir. a categorization that indicates the conjugation of pre-colonial notions of religious alterity with colonial racialization. My Christian Papuan interlocutors fear that extremist Muslims inside and outside of the Indonesian military call for religious war against them. Whereas there is a discrepancy between the way these two dominant racist models evaluate Chinese, highly in the white supremacy model and lowly in the light-skinned pre-Bumi model. Dark-skinned indigenous Indonesians are ranked lowly within both models. This compound racial subordination is a feature of global white supremacy in Indonesia. I think I will conclude my presentation there for the sake of having leaving some time for some discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim, Professor Daniels. Thank you very much. I think we're going to go directly to discussion. I'll just make one quick comment, which I think everybody heard in your presentation, issues of deep moral, ethical, political urgency, but also, if I may say so, something of your trademark combination of methodological and theoretical rigor and ethnographic and local knowledge particularity, the way in which you move between actual conversation, interactions, encounters with dark-skinned peoples, Papuans in particular, and then drew that up into a larger discussion of nationalism and then global white supremacism was once again breathtaking. I think we're going to open up. I just want to thank you again, Tim, for that just brilliant presentation. I will say no more, and I hope I'll turn it to the audience. And Megan, are you going to perhaps host the discussion?
I'm happy to step in. We were just looking at Whova. We do not yet have any questions generated from our audience on Whova. So if you might start us off with a question, and while we remind our audience to please submit questions, because we really would like to continue this conversation with your thoughts in mind as well. So perhaps, Bob, you might start us off with a question.
I'll be glad to do so. Everybody can hear me okay again?
Yes.
Timothy, just if I could, I mean, this is an APHIS conference. You've given us so much rich material for reflection already. I was wondering if you could, in just literally 2 or 3 minutes, juxtapose your experience in Indonesia with your experience in Malaysia. In many ways, I've learned so much about you in your recent work on Indonesia, and then some of it came up. The poisoning incident, if I recall, is discussed in your early Indonesia work, but at the same time, I recognize that you're really you have a wealth of experience and analytic rigor, that same trademark of linking ethnography to comparative research and broad transnational trends. You have demonstrated that, again, in an unparalleled way. There's nobody like you. In Malaysia, could you give us just perhaps 2 or 3 minutes of reflections on how your experience and how your theoretical understanding of Blackness and ethno-racial issues in Malaysia compares with that which you've given us such a fine description of here in Indonesia?
Thanks. It's a very, very good question. And actually, I have to begin by stating that it was actually a combined paper looking at some of my stories from the field in both Indonesia and Malaysia. And I had presented an early version of this talk at UNC a few years ago. And I decided for publication to separate them. So I'm still actually working on the Malaysian side of the material to enrich it, perhaps for a future publication. But there were some segments in there. Of course, I referred to some of the work that you noted of African international students, but also some of my experiences, which I want to explore a bit further as I write up work on Blackness in Malaysia with Malaysian Indians. I had a lot of experience with dark complexion Tamil Indians, right? The majority of Malaysian Indians are from a Tamil ethnic background. And I had a lot of interesting experiences with them. But in the papers, I began to reflect on it. There was a different sense of Blackness and a different sort of dynamic and resonance with them. But they definitely were aware, they're definitely racialized. But the way they try to move off of it with producing sort of a positive identification tends to center more around a Hindu sort of identification or Tamil identity and so forth. So it was different, but it was an experience that I had mentioned that I think I may meet with this Malaysian Indian, or I'm looking forward to hopefully meeting him when I travel to Malaysia in July. And it was at an event that was sponsored by the Malaysian Indian Congress. He was a leader in this group, and they were having a sari contest. It was during the time of Deepavali, I think, and these were public celebrations that I wrote about in the book. But this particular story, I hadn't really developed it or even mentioned it, I think, in the ethnographic text. But there were mostly, to get to the crux of the story, there was a very dark complexioned Indian woman who won that contest. The other, Malaysian Indian women were lighter complexion. And I was coming up to congratulate her, and he pulled me over and he was laughing, with some of their friends. Said, "You're going up because she's Black like you, and so it was interesting, those kind of experiences with both Tamil, Hindu groups, but also the Muslim Tamils. They asked me to walk with them, in different celebrations and so forth. So it was interesting, sort of the dynamic, but it's very different, I think, and I'm gonna try to develop it in my future work, than this sort of sense of Blackness and the connection I had with Papuans in Indonesia. I haven't had much experience with visiting any of the dark complexion Orang Asli in Malaysia. So again, that's something that I'm looking to do in my future research, hopefully this summer. But that's a very good question. I think in terms of my other experiences is very similar. One thing that is stark is that I had similar experiences with, in terms of public gawking and so forth, with Malays and also with Chinese Malaysians, which was different than Chinese in Indonesia, right? And so it's something to think about, reflect on. I haven't really produced analysis of that fully, but I think it, of course, has to do with the social and political context of a much larger and influential Malaysian Chinese minority group. But that was sort of interesting. But I did work hard, of course, which you could see in the ethnography, building cultural nationalism, develop relationships with all of these groups. And I became very close with many of the Malaysian Chinese and Malaysian Indian Hindus as well. But I think it's some different dynamics, of course, with the Malaysian Indian population in terms of their context, their relationships to land, right? Papuans are, living in what they look at as Tanah, Papua, right? His relationship with that land, the Indian population in Malaysia, of course, are fighting for their sacred sites and their spaces in the urban context, but it's been a different sort of negotiation for them. And then, of course, along with the Orang Asli as well, their government settlements, and there's been similar sort of racialization of some of their groups. as well. So it's something for some further exploration. And I think it was practical to sort of take that segment out of the initial paper and to really focus on the Indonesian part at this stage. But hopefully later this year, I'll develop the Malaysian portion. I'll be able to come back to you with a better answer, Bob.
Well, that was a pretty good answer. So thank you very much, Tim. If anybody's, I do have another question, but I would prefer to take it to the general questions, and then I can come back if there is somebody who has a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Bella or Buba?
There are a few, yeah. So go ahead, Megan.
Good.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and post some questions, and then we'll come back to yours, Bob, if there's time. This first question is coming from Galen Stoley, and they say, I'm wondering if you managed to catch Megawati's comments on Papuans the other day. Given the history of anti-miscegenation directed towards Black communities around the world, it's interesting to see the opposite sentiment deployed against them here as a means of erasing rather than containing that difference. Have you seen historical parallels for this in Indonesia or elsewhere?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was made aware of that statement, that public statement made by former President Megawati Soekarno Putri earlier today. Actually, one of my Papuan friends who happens to be living in exile in the US. He actually sent me a link to a newspaper article about it. You know, it's very problematic. I think looking at that, and as I was thinking about the talk, I was like, everything she was saying in there, you know, is really a demonstration of the arguments, right? Or arguments that, you know, the Papuans are, you know, should be part of the Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, but to do so and to improve their condition, they need to mix and to marry with light-skinned indigenous Indonesians, right? That would improve them. It would improve their genetics. I mean, all the racial science that has been embraced by the elites in Indonesia. And it just points out, I think, how it's problematic, not only in Indonesia, but other places. I think you're right. This is definitely something that's much broader in Malaysia, of course. And also, you know, we can look back at American society, right? We've also been trying to deal with, you know, with racial issues. It's been intensified, I think, over the last several years as well. You know, these are persisting ideas. And I think that comparatively in American society, we have been trying to deal with it, right? There's most institutions and businesses and schools, you know, have really gotten involved in diversity and equity inclusion. There's specialists working on this in institutions. There's anti-bias training and so on and so forth. And of course, I mean, I would make some of these recommendations for Indonesia and other places as well. And I think that Megawati Soekarno Putri's comments really begs for that, right? That we really need to have something to deal with the institutionalization of these ideas in the Indonesian context. And of course, it's not easy. There's always pushback, right? I can imagine there'd be pushback from some of the right-wing groups or hardline groups. And they all know these groups, they're Christians. And I mean, we get a lot of pushback. We're getting pushback as well in the US. And it's been hard and we've stuck at it. And I think we've made a lot of progress. Of course, you're probably aware in Indonesia that there's controversy over diversity, equity, inclusion groups. There's, you know, controversy over arguments that there's critical race theory being taught to children in schools and so forth. And there's been the emergence of a really a stronger sort of far right white supremacist groups in American society. But I think we do have some models there that have worked and they have been rather effective with making some change in some of these racialized worldviews. And so comparatively, you know, I think that, you know, there's definitely a need for that in Indonesia. I think I've been listening to several of the panels and I've been inspired by some of Bob's comments about agonistic plurality and the pluralism. And it's so exciting with the to progressive groups and the various moderate groups. And a lot of the progress that's being made with dealing with gender equality, and to some extent with equality of different sexualities and sexual minorities in Indonesia, and also the issue of religious minorities. But I think something that's sorely mixed in the Indonesian context is really dealing with race and looking at intersections of race with some of these other forms of difference that are still problematic and still need more work as well.
Thank you, Professor Daniels. Perhaps as an extension of this question of intersectionality, I have a question from Dr. Professor Sylvia Tiwan. She says, thank you for this powerful talk. Can you speak about Muslim Papuans and how they position themselves in this difficult landscape?
Yeah, it's there's definitely groups of Muslim Papuans that, I like to visit if things open up for visiting. But I have had contact mostly with Catholic and Protestant Papuans. But I've asked them about Muslims. They say, oh, you should visit Fak and some of the other areas, in different regions. And at least they tell me that Muslim Papuans are very firmly behind Papuan freedom, Merdeka, and they really want to have a change in sort of the political system as well, right? So they speak quite openly, and I've looked up some of the groups, but perhaps when we get on the ground, you can see some differences, right? And speaking to some other Indonesianists who have worked in some of those areas, I get some sense that there's some ambivalence, and some of the groups are still sort of connected and sort of see ties to the Muslim sultanates of Ternate and Tidore and so forth. And so there's different sort of identities, but at least my Papuan friends really embrace, or Christians, embrace the Muslim Papuans. And they assert to me quite strongly that most of them, at least, are in support of a referendum, and they want political independence. And they remind me that they're also racialized and, greeted and treated with these denigrating ideas as well. But on the other hand, when I speak to some of my Javanese friends who I've had close contact, they try to convince me on the other hand that the Javanese, that Papuans wouldn't be treated like this in a negative way if they were Muslims, right? And so they try to remind me that, they're treated and they're called these names and treated in a negative way because they're not Muslims. And sometimes it's a reaction to their cultural differences in local context. So, I mean, some different sort of voices and perspective, but definitely I put a lot of weight and credence with my Papuan interlocutors that I'm quite close with over the years. And they do state, and I found some evidence that definitely there's some Muslim Papuan groups that have expressed strong support for Merdeka.
Thank you, Dr. Daniels. Let me share this next question from Ifas and Gigi Wegs. Given the ways visual dioramas and museums often repeat racist tropes, as you describe, I'm struck by the power of soundscapes to disrupt global white supremacy. In the example you gave of common musical interests with your Papuan friends and colleagues, can soundscapes provide an alternate media for scholarly resistance and an affirmation of Blackness in Indonesia and Southeast Asia?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think just more recently as well, I think there's been a lot of the Papuan activists have used the genre of reggae music, which is quite popular. And I'll find this on social media with some of my friends who are Papuans. They'll post videos of pop stars, really, expressing support for Papuan human rights and freedom using sort of a reggae sort of genre and dynamic. But I also have to note that some of my Papuan friends are also they were very much inclined towards country music, right? It definitely was a strain of some of my friends I remember who would listen to country music as well, right? So it's quite diverse, but yeah, definitely some of the sound waves, the hip hop and so forth, as Sarah Richards pointed out, I think there is a sense of an avenue and a connection with those soundscapes that definitely disrupt white supremacy in many ways in our embodiments of a positive Black identity.
Wonderful. Yeah, those structures of feeling that connect us deeper than our intellectual connections sometimes. Those are all of the questions that I have. I'm seeing on, oh no, I'm sorry. There is one more question from Bella. In fact, Bella, would you like to pose your question directly?
I can. Thank you so much thanks, Megan. Thank you so much, Professor Daniels. And so I'm gonna read what I wrote. I think I'll be clear. There's still a significant gap in knowledge and understanding and awareness, even among individuals affiliated to, and sometimes those who hold leadership positions in higher education institutions in Indonesia, about anti-Blackness sentiments and racisms in Indonesia, which is deeply, deeply problematic. So who should be / where can we find sources of educational authority that can really engage us, sort of, and I mean sort of educational communities at large in Indonesia, faculty members, students, leadership, K-12 or K-16, I mean university level, to really recognize these problems, recognize the histories, and sort of like the way that you're framing it is sort of the conjecture of colonial legacies into post-colonial racial formation, racist formations, and really speak to perpetrators, to bystanders, and then speak for victims of micro and macro aggressions, whether psychological or physical violence, and really sort of help all of us kind of move forward by knowing the problem and knowing what to do and knowing how to learn about it and produce knowledge and produce discourse that's progressive and liberating and sort of healing, and to stop hurting each other, to stop hurting Black people in Indonesia.
I'm not sure what to say about where you would start in Indonesia. I know there is an Indonesian People's Front for West Papua, and they're largely Indonesian youth. Some of them are academic, oriented. But they're activists. But unfortunately, they also have been severely repressed by the government. I communicated with one of the leaders who's from the Batak Christian background. And, he's in touch, with the founder of the West Papuan Liberation Organization, who fortunately was able to escape Indonesian intelligence and make it to the US. He's living in the US now. Looking forward to him coming to New York City, because he's active with trying to go to the UN and try to do presentations on the Papuan issue to try to convince the UN to mediate. There's some hopeful ideas that some of my Papuan contacts have expressed to me, with the UN coming in to sort of mediate a dialogue and perhaps having a real referendum on independence this time. There's some hope in these areas, but he's active here in New York, and he's in the U.S., not in New York City right now. But he's put me in touch with some of the leaders of the Indonesian Front for People's Front for West Papua, FRIWP. You can look them up. The problem with them coming out and helping with any of these things, again, in Indonesia, is that it's very intense repression, and they're very outright and out front in terms of their support of self-determination for Papuans. What may be sort of useful and pragmatic is to sort of have an anti-racist group that wouldn't be so explicit about the political connection, but to work then in the schools to try to deal with some of these ideas and to de-institutionalize some of these notions. And that would be an interesting area to look. Definitely, you know, if I find something or speak to my friends, I'll put you in touch with some. But I think it's hopeful, again, going back to, you know, what Bob has written about in, you know, many years, civil Islam, and what he spoke about in a panel last night. I think that, and also Muhammad Ali, you know, some of his recent work on Islam Kiri. I'm wondering if there's some other groups, right? Because I've been really, you know, looking and asking my Indonesian country, what are the groups? Are there any of these leaders, you know, Muhammadiyah, is anyone speaking out about the Papuan issue? And for the most part, they're telling me no. But of course, with some of my work earlier on the Maya movement, there was definitely an open with the Maya movement to bring in some of the Papuans to talk about, right? They were very open to having these dialogues and so forth. And that's one thing that I remember from past experience. But I think my contacts have told me that I think Amin Rais at one point had made a public statement in support of Papua. And I think some public figures are coming out after the criticism of Megawati Sukarnoputri's racist comments that if you have that position, well, I'm in support of Papua Merdeka, right? And so, again, I also am hopeful that we'll be able to find some groups that will emerge to try to do some instruction for anti-racism training. And so I agree with you that that's something that's definitely needed.
Professor Daniels, I have one more question that's come through Huva. We have about 4 minutes left for this official plenary, just to let you know. This question's coming from Malang Chilangasan, and they say, I'm curious if you have experienced these kinds of perceptions from North Maluku or NTT people towards Papuans from neighboring provinces. Would it be a similar pattern to those Western or mainland Indonesian reactions?
No, I haven't. I haven't got those kind of experiences, and definitely I do have some contact with Hadir, an Albanese anthropologist, who is quite open. He's doing a lot of work. Actually, I think if someone's interested in doing some work in the U.S. and Indonesia on Papua, I think he would be someone who would be good to collaborate with, right, in terms of our theme of collaboration. And he has invited me to that his department would sponsor me if I was interested in coming and doing some work. So I may look into that in the future as well. But I haven't seen that kind of expression. Of course, my interlocutors did tell me that that they do get the sense from their experiences that many of the Albanese and other sort of residents with other ethnic groups in East Nusa Tenggara also have these negative ideas about Papuans and sort of have a sense that they have a sense of superiority over them. But I haven't had any direct experience with interviewing them and collecting data on those sort of feelings myself directly.
All right, thank you. I have exhausted the questions in front of me at the moment. We just have about 2 minutes. So Bob, if you think you can squeeze your question in 2 minutes, then we can move to it.
Well, my question is actually not as interesting as the talk has been, so I feel kind of like, but okay. It's actually slightly more anthropological question, and it has to do with indigeneity. The paradox, it's not a paradox because you've explained it so well, but perhaps it's an irony of Papuan identity in Indonesia is that we're in the midst since the late 90s, but particularly since Reformasi began, of a kind of revival of a discourse of keaslian. And of course, Papuan, it's hard for anyone to deny that they are not orang asli. But clearly orang asli and indigeneity can mean different things. Do you want to comment on that? That's a big issue in anthropology these days as well. But here in Indonesia, it has some real kind of substance to it. Any thoughts on that? paradox, irony?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, that's interesting as well comparatively to look at Malaysia, right, where there's definitely been a lot of controversy about that. Are the Malays actually, indigenous? Did they come from elsewhere? There's a contrast with the Orang Asli and the Bumiputra who are in Sabah and so forth. In Indonesia, I think is interesting. I think some of it, again, is part of the dynamic within the post-colonial formation, right, where you had a lot of these groups that were just clumped together, but they have some independent senses of self as well. And of course, many of them have been marginalized within sort of the Javanese-centric state. And that's something that really struck me when I went to Palembang, was the amount of animosity there in South Sumatra amongst the Malay ethnic group about the Javanese and the Javanese-centric state, right? And that was a very volatile thing. They wanted to get guns. I mean, it was just some things I haven't written about at all there, but it was definitely a sense that that there was this sort of division and divide, right? The contrast. And so I think a lot of that sort of emergence of different senses of indigeneity in Indonesia, that they're linked to this sense of the post-colonial formation, where it's been very, Jakarta and Javanese centric.
I just want to, Megan, I'll hand it to you, but I want to just thank you again, Tim, for just a fascinating, fantastic, spot on presentation. Last comment, every time I'm in a panel or otherwise hear you talk, I've been in India, even though you got the whiter beard, I've been in this field for a long time. And I always learn not something new, I learned so much new from listening to you and your experience, and you've done it again tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bob. And thank you, APHIS and MSU.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Daniels. Before I get back to our Master of Ceremonies, I just want to share one more comment that did come into Huva. This is from Cheryl Brown. And she says, thank you for your insightful research and experiences and intersectional presentation to bring more societal and scholarly awareness to the depth of the racism and conflict. As an African-American woman who began with the study of China and Southeast Asia at University of Michigan in 1975, I appreciate your work in many respects. And thank you also to APHIS for this featured presentation, APHIS and MSU. So with that, I will hand it back to our MC.
Thank you very much.
Gratitude and thanks, Professor Daniels.
Okay. Wow. I personally have learned a lot from this session. This is a very powerful session. And I think I speak for everyone where along these sessions that sometimes we're too stunned to speak, especially on the poisoning experience. But ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we have come to the end of the special talk. I want to thank Professor Daniels for being here and delivering the interesting insights regarding racial status in Indonesia, for highlighting the issues that are somehow forgotten in Indonesia. Thank you, Professor Daniels. I hope you have a good day ahead. And of course, this session will not run smoothly without the facilitation from Dr. Hafner. And so thank you, Dr. Hafner, and thank you, Bu Megan, for jumping in and making sure it ran smoothly. I also want to thank the participants who have been very conducive and active during this session. Thank you, it was truly wonderful. Lastly, I would like to, this conference would not be possible without the generous support from our sponsor, from our media sponsor, and yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, through this session have ended, there are still a lot of interesting sessions where you can participate. Let's not forget that. You can access your WUVA and find that we have the live exhibitor session, which will happen right after the session ended. And then we have the next plenary session, which is the closing session. And of course, the special session where you can watch traditional Sundanese performance, Seni Tradisi Sunda dalam Budaya Masa Kini, which will be presented by Paguyuban Mahasiswa Sastra Sunda. and it will be very interesting. So I'm looking forward for your participation here and there, and this where you can access through your Whova. I think that's it for today. I'm Indira, and thank you for your participation here today. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Terima kasih sekali.